So Gladiator 2 is something I didn't originally see in theaters, but I wanted to do a late non-spoiler review for this film, as I do think it is something enjoyable to watch. And while I don't think that it's better than the original, I do think that this is a captivating sequel to the 2000 Best Picture Gladiator movie. And even though there is such a big gap between the releases of this film, I think it is ultimately fitting to the story, which takes place roughly 16 years after the events of Gladiator 1. And overall, I thought that there was some elements of the story that did seem like a stretch in terms of connecting this to the first, but I do think that it is possible to make sense of everything. And I think there are a lot of parallels to the first movie. In particular, you do find Rome in a place of struggle with improper leadership, but I do think that over the course of the movie, you do see Rome undergoing its own arc, which I think is an interesting deviation from the first movie. And to speak in just general terms for how I felt about this film, I did think that Gladiator 2 really excels in terms of being well shot and well acted. The plot is a little shaky at times, but I do think that it did enough to keep me entertained throughout. My only real criticisms for this would be that besides the plot itself, there was maybe a few moments that did feel a little out of place, such as the CGI, whether or not that was a stylistic choice. And I did think that there was some occasional generic dialogue, but this was an enjoyable movie for me, and I do think that it does deserve some checking out on streaming. To break this down further and to shift this into my rubric, in terms of the cinematography, I did think that this movie did an excellent job following the first and really creating that immersive feel for Rome and for the Colosseum. I think you got a lot of good POV here as well, since this is the closest we'll get to experiencing the Colosseum besides visiting it in person. So I do think that Ridley Scott was great to direct this here again, and I think that this was also great to really capture the same aesthetic as the first movie. So I would say that the visuals was definitely the strongest aspect of this movie for me. So I would have to give it a 5 out of 5. And speaking towards the plot, again, without getting into any specifics, I do think I was a little bit unsure early on as to the overall direction for this film, but I do think that after watching the conclusion that there was a good enough job tying together multiple loose ends throughout the course of the movie. But since there was a few aspects that weren't as strong for me, I would have to give it a 4 out of 5 here. And as far as the acting and the cast goes, I do think you have pretty much an all-star cast here, and I would say that the acting was probably the second best aspect of this film. It's definitely a tough act to follow up on Russell Crowe along with Joaquin Phoenix's performances, but I did really like Paul Mescal for this role in addition to Pedro Pascal. And we have seen that the director does like to work with Russell Crowe in the past. You also see that with Denzel Washington, and I thought he was neat to see in this. But if I had to give a score, I don't think the acting was as good as the first movie, and I do think maybe you have some limitations in terms of how the plot or the writing played out for certain scenes, so I would probably have to give this a 4 out of 5, and I think that would be an appropriate score. In terms of the directing and dialogue, I think that the issue for the film would probably pertain mostly towards its dialogue than anything else. I do really like, though, the references to the first movie, which did have a lot of memorable lines and quotes, but I don't think you really get any of that from this film directly, and I do think that some lines do come off a little basic and a little cheesy, so I would probably have to go a 3 out of 5 here, as the dialogue is definitely this movie's weakest link for me. But for the overall setting, I think that the atmosphere this movie captures really sells itself. I do think that for being someone that is a fan of historical fictions, I think the world building here is really established well throughout these two movies. And I think that the Colosseum and Rome really make a great draw for cinema besides everything else. And in terms of maybe the more extravagant gladiator battles that you get in this in comparison to the first movie, I don't think that those really do anything to take away from the atmosphere. And that does seem to be fairly historically accurate in terms of the sea battles, for instance. So I didn't really have a problem with that at all. I would say in terms of the overall setting, maybe stuff with the plot or the dialogue take you out a little bit. But overall, I thought that the movie did a great job capturing Rome in this period. So I would have to go a 4 out of 5 in terms of the setting and overall immersion or environment present here. So out of 25 points total, I would have to give this a 20 or a 80%, which would be a B minus. And I think that Gladiator 2 wouldn't fall on the top of any great movie list like the first one does, but I did think that this was one of the better films that I have watched in a long time. There is a little bit of gore and violence as the movie is rated R for this reason, but I do feel like it is a pretty positive watch. And there are maybe a few sad scenes or heartfelt moments, but I would say that the ending is mostly uplifting, and I do think that there are a lot of good messages throughout this film, so it definitely is something that I would recommend, especially now on streaming. But feel free to let me know your thoughts on this movie, and I'll see you later.